In this video, my plan is to try to introduce the idea of postmodernism and its links with history, or the discipline of history. Before we get going, what I think we need to do is present a couple of definitions that will help us deal with some of the complexity that I will hopefully arrive at later. And the first of these is the idea of postmodernity. This is, I think, distinct from postmodernism in that postmodernity is an era or period that I think is largely defined by a post-industrial world and a post-colonial world. That is a world not defined by factories and labor necessarily, and a world not defined by empires. It is rather defined by all kinds of different industries and all kinds of different nation states that exist around the world. Currently, we are up to more than 190 nation states rather than several major European empires. And the second definition that I quickly want to introduce is postmodernism itself. What I'm really referring to when I talk about postmodernism is a set of ideas that emphasize instability and localization of all knowledge. What I mean by localization there is the tendency in postmodernism to suggest that knowledge cannot be seen in any universal sense, i.e. there are no large meta-narrative truths that we can find our identity within. Rather, the knowledge that we have is really localized around our own self. And as we'll see as well, postmodernists tend to actually problematize the basic idea of the self. Generally speaking, if we think of the broad idea of how history had been thought about for many years and how knowledge in general had been thought about for many years, is you generally get this idea of philosophers speaking of a person or a thing that knows, the knower, and they have the ability to use, say, facts, language, their own experiences, and also, most importantly, perhaps rationality, to build a bridge back to something that we might call reality. So the idea here is that individuals, the knowers, can actually use these tools to develop a sense of what is real, the real world. So knowledge is not just an idea or a dream or a fabrication, but is actually a true representation of the real world itself. In postmodernism, there has been a tendency to challenge the idea that facts or language or someone's individual experiences, and certainly the idea of rationality, can actually build a bridge to reality. They've gone even further than this and actually argued that there really isn't a thing called reality. What there is just a knower in a world, okay? And even actually they have problematized this idea of what it means to be this knowing person. They have actually argued for something far more complex. What they've suggested is that instead of a stable individual that makes observations about the world, we get something far more unstable. A person or a thing that is porous. Okay, so this diagram is simply meant to represent an individual, and I've tried to keep the line open rather than closed, because I think what postmodernists tend to suggest is that individuals and perhaps their psychology or their mind is not stable in any way. It is porous. So yes, we are an individual, and yes, we are filled with many different qualities. We have experiences, certainly. We make observations about the world. We have a body that houses and allows us to act in the world. We have decisions that we need to make. We have values that we develop over time. We certainly have beliefs. We make use of words. We read words. We use them to our advantage and disadvantage sometimes. And we also have feelings. The point that postmodernists would tend to make, though, is that none of these features of ourself are stable or static over time. In fact, what you get is the idea that actually our values might actually radically change. They might turn upside down. Some of our beliefs may disappear over time. We might change our mind about perhaps the existence of God or the non-existence of God. Our bodies too might undergo radical transformation. So the point here is that there is nothing stable or static or lasting about the individual. It is always in a constant state of flux. So I need to link these ideas with a couple of scholars. There are many scholars who could be brought up to discuss the origins and structures of postmodern thought. Many people would also make the observation that it's hard to define exactly what postmodernism is because many different philosophers go into making it up. But let's just try to pin down some of the major themes of postmodernism and link them to specific philosophers. And I think it is important to highlight that these were philosophers. The people who are most associated with the development of postmodern thought were firstly philosophers, and then I think artists, and then it moved out into other disciplines such as history. So firstly, one of the main philosophers that you will come across in reading about postmodernism is Derrida, a French philosopher who argued, among many other things, the idea that language was inherently unstable. So his basic idea here is that language cannot communicate stably anything substantial about the world. We use all sorts of language in all different contexts, and it can be read in many different ways. If we use a basic example, what he's trying to argue here is that, take a simple sentence, I put the book on the second shelf of my desk. Now that sounds like a very simple sentence that someone could follow to find the book that I am looking for. But if you break it down into its parts, some of those words can be quite ambiguous. So when I suggested the book, which book am I talking about? When I suggested my desk, am I talking about my desk at home? Am I talking about my desk at work? Am I talking about my desk in my office or my desk in another room? Am I talking about the second shelf from the bottom or the second shelf from the top? It sounds like a silly example, but even with a simple idea like that, you can see that language is not absolutely clear in that particular context. Now, how much more Derrida would suggest language becomes unclear when we begin to discuss abstract things like philosophy, when we begin to talk about God or the nature of existence or the idea of epistemology, how we know what we know. Language becomes even more unstable in those contexts. So that's an important theme of postmodernism, the idea that language cannot carry substantial truths about the world. Secondly, we might mention here a philosopher, Lyotard, who was basically, I think at one point in his life, was a self-avowed Marxist, and he came to disassociate himself with Marxism and also develop a strong criticism of what we will call meta-narratives. Now, meta-narratives are basically those large philosophical or ideological stories about the world that have really shaped very much the 20th century and many of the centuries prior to that. So probably two that we could point out here that have been very, very powerful in terms of Western civilization would be Christianity, which tells a large story of a beginning of the universe with a God, and that God will one day come back and judge the world along some sort of moral line. The second major meta-narrative that Lyotard might might target in this context is Marxism itself. The idea that the world was moving towards some sort of inevitable revolution that would see a transformation of politics, of economics, and of social relationships. And he argues that these are dangerous because they provide closure, and they provide a disincentive to go away and actually develop really critically your own understanding of the world. It's too easy, he might say, to slavishly grab a meta-narrative and define yourself within that meta-narrative and then stop looking for alternatives. So he is actually arguing against the idea of using meta-narratives to locate ourselves within the world. The third philosopher that I'm going to quickly raise here is Michel Foucault, who's another French philosopher, who argued, again, among many other things, perhaps one of his most important ideas, is that we always have to understand knowledge within the context of power. And what that means is, he's suggesting here, is that the types of knowledge that become normal or become powerful are always linked with particular social structures that in a sense, underwrite that particular form of knowledge. For example, Christianity became a state religion, and it was endorsed by kings, queens all across Europe, and therefore he suggests it became the normal or the accepted version of reality. He would also, I think he was more particularly focused on smaller ideas, you might say, in one sense, but the issues of, say, health. So mental health particularly, how do we define what is insanity? He would ask this idea and suggest that really there is no absolute universal definition of insanity. Actually what it is a social definition that we agree upon, and why we agree upon it is for all sorts of political and social reasons. And generally it is the powerful groups or individuals within a society who get to define those particular ideas. Another idea he was very interested in was the idea of sexuality and gender. So the idea that how do we actually understand what is normal sexual behavior? Again, he would argue there's no such thing as a universal normal sexual behavior. What we have done is we have marginalized certain sexual behaviors and we have made others dominant according to the power structures within a society. So he's suggesting that knowledge can never be separated from power. Just to quickly highlight what I was talking about before, and that is that postmodernism really started with philosophers and then began to move into the artistic world. Think of the work of someone like Banksy here. Banksy being that anonymous artist who has become very well known for street art, essentially. And that street art is very playful, but also very political. So the idea here, again, is that Banksy's art does not necessarily, or didn't at the beginning at least, begin from a representation in a gallery or some sort of powerful institution. It actually began on the streets. And it often, if you think of Banksy images, they often borrow from other famous images. And he plays around with those to, in some cases, be quite humorous, and in others to be quite political, in many cases to combine the two. You might also think about the idea of punk rock, so the music punk rock, which really became popular from the 1970s. People often talk about punk rock as representing ideas of postmodernism because it was really challenging what Foucault had argued in terms of power. Punk rock was challenging the power norms in societies, and it began to promote the idea of disassociating yourself with normal activity, or what was considered at least normal activity, and perhaps even going to that point where it argued that destroying those power structures was actually a moral objective for individuals. So just think of those as very, very simple ideas in terms of how postmodernism may have begun to affect the artistic world. What, in summary, I'm getting at here is basically that the philosophers had really promoted the idea that knowledge was unstable. It could never be any more than unstable by the virtue of the fact that we cannot explain it in any stable manner, that there are no meta-narratives that we can draw upon for stability, and that knowledge, rather than being connected to any universal idea, is connected to power, which is really constructed by individual societies. And when we come to the art, I've suggested that it reflects a general idea of playfulness and disruption. So borrowing from the instability, resisting the idea of universality and playing instead with art, and also rejecting the idea of accepting power and perhaps even acting to disrupt power where possible or necessary. So some central themes that really come up in postmodern thought, again, this is not comprehensive, it's a really basic introduction. So just see this simply as an orientation to some of the major ideas you'll come across in larger readings on postmodernism. But one of the main important themes, I think, is the idea that there is in the world no knower or known. So we've already established that idea that postmodernists really challenged the idea that there was a reality, or that there was a stable individual that could know that reality. What they're suggesting is that certainly there are phenomena that are experienced, but those phenomena can't really be assembled in any final story so that its meaning can be completely told. Secondly, one of the other major themes of postmodernism is that there are no centers of reality, and this is a building on the last point. There are no centers of reality, only, as Foucault suggested, centers of power. So if we trace knowledge and ideas back to their origins, it's probably unlikely that we will trace them back to the universe or reality, says Foucault, but we will trace them back to power structures in some way. Thirdly, the world is a text, and this has a lot to do with Derrida and other philosophers who argued that it's not just literature that we're talking about here, but that many other objects can be read also as texts. So you could think of clothing as text, uniforms. You might deconstruct a uniform and trying to discover what that uniform is actually attempting to perhaps say. about a particular group of people or the institution that attempts to impose the idea of the uniform on that group of people. So you can read those uniforms in the same way that you might read a book, try and unpick it for what its intended meaning is. So there is a mass expansion of the idea of texts with postmodernism. And fourthly, generally speaking, there is a radical opposition within much postmodern thought to dominance, and again with this idea of power. I've suggested here that we might think of that as something called hyperliberty. That's just a word I've applied here to describe the idea that we're not just talking about huge forms of power in the sense of, say, governments or militaries. What we're talking about also are local forms of power, where perhaps in a school setting or perhaps in a work setting, we could see power structures at work, and we should, according to many postmodernists, be resisting those power structures. If we think about postmodernism and history more explicitly, I'd like to connect a couple of themes to those four ideas. And these are how really asking the question how those ideas have begun to actually affect the way people think about history or practice history. And if we think of the idea of this first theme here, that there is no knower or known just phenomena, one way in which this is manifested in history is by people developing chaotic and unresolved representations. What I mean by this is that there have been some people who have experimented with histories that don't try to tell the story of a particular event or person or group, but rather actually leave it unresolved. So they get to the end of perhaps their book, and they don't argue something along the lines of, this is why I think this particular event happened, but they leave it open for the reader to decide. So the idea of them trying to capture this idea of phenomena being impossible to completely encapsulate in a meaningful story. Secondly, if we think of the idea of no centers of reality, only centers of power, one way this has affected history is by the development of a focus on marginality. So groups that have been written out of history, so to speak. So you get many histories in postmodernism that look at groups that have not been discussed. So one recent book I saw come out in Australia was a book about homosexual soldiers in the Australian military. So a group that doesn't typically get much of attention in, say, the official histories. These historians have begun to actually try to draw those groups more to the surface and discuss how they experienced war, how they experienced Australian society, and so on. Thirdly, if we think of the world as a text, this theme has affected history in a very profound way, and that really is that there are a mass expansion of readings in the later 20th and 21st centuries. So what I mean here is that many histories now actually look at different objects as source material, not just documents, not just traditional artifacts, but all types of objects can become read as text. As I used before, the example of uniforms could be read as text as well. I've seen some histories that, again, military histories that look not just at the soldiers, but say at how the soldiers viewed objects like weapons, so their gun. How did they view their gun? What was their relationship to the gun? And what did that mean for them? And so there is a mass expansion of readings, and that has also led to a mass opening of the types of histories that have been therefore written and constructed. And finally, this is a little bit of a controversial point, but what I'm suggesting here is with an opposition to dominance, there is a kind of quasi-intellectual anarchism here. And what I'm suggesting, I'm not trying to belittle this by any means. What I'm suggesting is that there is an encouragement from postmodernism to not so much worry about what you're writing or whether someone powerful like a professional historian will critique you. If you develop a way of understanding, then deliver that understanding, and don't worry about whether you'll get a book deal or something like that about it. Start a blog, write the blog, and begin to have your own say in this particular kind of discourse or dialogue. So if I summarize that even further, what I think there are two sorts of, in a sense, postmodernism. This is an oversimplification, but again, an attempt just to basically orient us to the ideas. There are two basic kinds of postmodernism. There's the more moderate postmodernism. I mean, in one way, it's kind of silly to talk about moderate postmodernism because it's generally quite radical. But I've tried to use the word more there to clarify what I'm suggesting. And there is very radical postmodernism. Very radical postmodernists tend to actually be very, very critical of traditional history. And I've used the word hatred there to try and really reaffirm that. I'm not suggesting that they hate historians or anything like that. I'm suggesting that there is a real critique of the way history has been done, suggesting that it really has not done anything meaningful to progress human society or progress human knowledge. So they see it as a waste of time, some postmodernists. So many of them would suggest that we actually turn away from traditional history and instead focus on things like philosophy or fiction as useful vehicles for thinking about the world and thinking about the future. So, for example, one author here, Richard Rorty, when he developed a sense of his utopia in a number of his works, he argued really that history would not have a place in an ideal world for him, because historians don't really contribute anything meaningful to our knowledge of the world. And they can't, according to their philosophy. On the more moderate side of things, some people who espouse postmodern thought, or even are sympathetic to some of the ideas and wouldn't necessarily call themselves a postmodernist, they have used the ideas of postmodernism to push for a remodeling of history, to suggest that some of these ideas could be relevant and actually helpful. And there has, as a result, been a great experimentation with history from, or at least an encouragement to experimentation with history from these particular thinkers. And I would suggest that it is this kind of thinking about postmodernism that has had the strongest impact on the historical profession. In a previous video, I discussed the idea of thinking about history in terms of three phases. The history of history ran through the period of the pre-Enlightenment. It ran through the period running from about the 18th century through the end of the Second World War, and also the late 20th century and early 21st century. Postmodernism really is associated with this last period. The idea that history has become once again a very fragmented discipline with many people producing many kinds of histories, and to a large extent people tending to celebrate that fragmentation, and the most positive reading of it being a description that history has once again been democratized, that it has been the profession in a sense has no longer the dominant voice, and that it has been democratized. Anyone can actually talk about the past. So in postmodernity, I think history has actually changed, and it has partly to do with postmodern philosophy. But in postmodernity, the era, history has taken on a slightly different shape. At least there are new histories being added to the way we actually do things. If we look at this in terms of three general areas: epistemology, or the way we know about the world, and secondly, the method of history, and thirdly, the products of history, I think postmodernity has some unique features. Firstly, if we think about epistemology, there has been, I think, among historians a strong resistance to the radical skepticism promoted by postmodern philosophers like Derrida. Not many historians would accept that there is no knower or known. So there are people like Keith Winchuttle, or more perhaps moderately Richard J. Evans, who would argue that there is still something called reality, and historians can still know something of it. Maybe not everything, but something. So the other idea, though, I think in terms of epistemology is that historians, many historians, if not most, have come to accept the postmodernist philosophers' call to see language as central to our understanding of the world, and also to see culture as a very powerful historical force. In the early 20th century, historians and philosophers tend to focus on forces like economics to explain change in history. So why did a particular event take place? Many historians would look to economic and social structures to do that. Postmodernists have said that we also need to look to culture and to language, and I think many historians have accepted that that is actually a reasonable claim. So although they're resisting the radical skepticism, many historians are accepting the idea that history does need to account for language and culture, as well as other things like social classes and economics. So that has led to, I think, a shift in method, where we have an expansion of what the idea of a text is, and so therefore an expansion of the idea of sources. So history is being compiled from all sorts of different sources, far outside traditional documents and traditional artifacts dug up by by archaeologists. So that's one way the method of historians has begun to shift in postmodernity. Secondly, I think it's also true to say that old sources, those documents and the artifacts, have begun to be read in different ways, looking at the language, looking at the cultural traits that they actually represent or resist. So the idea that our even older sources that were once very dear to historians are still used, but they might be used in very different ways given the different methods of linguistic analysis or cultural analysis that have emerged with postmodernity. And finally, all of this has actually led to, I think, an opening up of the types of products of history that we see. So one of the main ideas of history linked with postmodernity, or one of the main products of history, are the micro-histories. So books like Carlo Ginzburg, The Cheese and the Worms, which focuses in on an individual and basically frames the entire narrative around that individual, focusing in on a micro issue and how that particular person saw the world. Instead of, you think of this as instead of a national or a meta-narrative type history that we associate with perhaps Marxism or religious historicism like Christianity. So postmodern histories tend to, in some cases, focus on very, very small topics. Secondly, we have developed in this particular period a very strong emphasis on cultural histories. Histories that look at the language or look at the history of ideas within a particular group of people. And I'll show you an example of a cultural history in a second. Thirdly, there are those uncertain histories, those unresolved histories that we talked about before, and that they have become popular as well. So where the historian doesn't aim to say, here is the definitive answer as to why a particular event happened, but perhaps suggest 3 or 4 different ways of looking at that, and leaving it up to the reader to really decide for themselves what they actually think. And finally, there has also been an encouragement towards non-published histories in postmodernity. And what I mean here is that, again, perhaps out of inspiration of the idea of resisting power, that some historians have resisted publishing companies, perhaps, and tried to present their histories in more free ways. So the idea of publishing, say, content online and making it freely available to people is one way that this is being done. And if you think about it, there are many bloggers, there are many websites where people have become quite influential in thinking about historical topics, even though they haven't necessarily written books or even maybe been trained as historians. So I think there is an encouragement in postmodernity for these types of histories as well. And I'm suggesting here that what they are encouraging is any content to be produced, no matter what form it is actually in. If you are discussing substantial historical content, then that's fine. It does not have to be published in a book by a famous publishing company. It can be done in any form. So if we think of some examples here, this is a book I came across recently, The Smile Revolution in 18th Century Paris by Colin Jones. And this could be considered a good example of a cultural history where Colin Jones is focusing in on the idea of smiling and how a group of people, particularly the French, saw smiles and what role they played in their societies. It obviously connects to larger themes of happiness. What did happiness mean in 18th century Paris? So that's a good example of a cultural history. Another very well-known example of a cultural history is Stephen Kotkin's Magnetic Mountain, which examines the phenomenon of Stalinism in Russia in the 1930s particularly. And what he suggests in this book is that Stalinism actually represented a kind of civilization, a unique civilization with its own language, its own cultural structures. And in one chapter, Learning to Speak Bolshevik, he suggests that many people actually learn to live within that civilization by learning a new language and using that language to their advantage. So again, another good example of a cultural history focused on ideas and culture rather than economic structures per se. Thirdly, this is a recent book by an Australian historian, Carolyn Holbrook, Anzac, the Unauthorised Biography. And this looks at the history of the idea of Anzac in Australian culture and tries to show how the word and the concept have evolved over time. So what role Anzac plays in Australian society is really the emphasis of this book. And it's a fascinating analysis of how Australians think of this particular concept. Which again is another good example of a postmodern influence type history.